Empowered Health, a podcast shedding light on how healing is an inside job. Keys to your inner power and total transformation. Discussing wholeness, wellness, and the effects of the mind on the physical and energetic parts of our being. A podcast to support you, moving from fear and pain into wellness and purpose. Belief, hope, connection, energetic keystones for transformation and inner power. Sacred knowledge that inspires us to look within, to find our own unique path. Empowered Health, release and rewire to become what you truly are, strong, whole, and empowered.
Welcome to the Empowered Mind podcast, the keys to empowered health and heart-aligned living. Today's guest is Deidre Reigel. Dedra is a lifelong advocate of inner healing, a singer, dancer, conductor, composer, pianist, and author. She produced her own Broadway Vegas revue and founded her own opera orchestra. She's done 2 Eastern European conducting tours. She worked in Quebec as a singer-dancer, was a vocal coach in Tokyo. She is currently in California developing a short film about the creation of the universe and a new album of guided contemplation, plus a new book about healing relationships with our parents. Dedra is the host of the Deidre Reigel Hope and Healing Radio podcast show. Welcome, Dedra.
Thank you so much, Jayne. It's such a delight to be here, and I consider it a great privilege and honor.
Dedra, you have an amazing story of forgiveness and beyond forgiveness that you call it. And it comes from a really difficult childhood, which many have come through, but yours is extraordinary. Can you just tell us your story and how it led into this beyond forgiveness?
Well, first of all, let me frame this from the spiritual aspect, which is where I believe everything emanates and resolves. I chose the perfect parents. My mother was an incredibly beautiful woman on the exterior and a person of deep understanding, a very wise woman. She had been raped when she was 19 years old and still a virgin. She was raped by her 38-year-old married boss. And this was an era in our history when we just didn't talk about these things. To add to the wounding in her core family, her older sister had become pregnant out of wedlock, and the father demanded that the older sister receive an abortion. And this, of course, was way before Roe versus Wade, and the sister ultimately died of sepsis that was induced by the abortion. So there was a lot of wounding in my mother. There was a lot of wounding in her family. And of course, she grew up in small town America. So, as was so often the case in those days, that wound was not even spoken about, therefore was, as we understand, deeply buried in her psyche. So as a married woman, she was not expecting to have children. Both my parents were considered medically sterile. They were married for 5 years, and all of a sudden my mother turns up 5 months pregnant. I came a month early. I was very sickly as a child, of course, and in fact nearly died when I was 8 weeks old. So there was a lot of stress that happened in the family around my birth, and again, compassion for my parents. They were not prepared in any way. So as time went on, my mother, of course, would experience a trigger to her rape, and that happened when I was about 3.5 years old. And the quick backstory is there that my parents had been moved by my father's company to Birmingham, Alabama. And this was at a time when in this country, the race riots were still happening on a fairly regular basis. And even though we lived in a very affluent part of town and were able to afford a maid who was African American, we were still exposed to many of the difficult scenes that would happen. And so as I began my healing process in earnest with my mother, about 4 years ago, I was the recipient of one of these memories just popping up, a memory that I had deeply buried. And so I was about 3.5 years old when what I'm about to tell happened. And I remember napping in the afternoon, and the strong hands of our maid, whose name was, by the way, the same as my mother's sister who died, came and just picked me up by her strong hands, held me to her breast, and ran out the front door, where I joined my parents. We were all standing on the porch in this beautiful tree-lined street in Birmingham, Alabama, in broad daylight, watching an African-American woman be raped and sodomized by a Caucasian man in broad daylight directly across the street from our porch. Now, looking back, I realized this must have triggered my mother. Looking back, suddenly we were transferred back up north, so to speak, and until I was about 7 years old, my mother was able to keep it together. But by that time, I was in second grade, and I remember coming home from school, and my mother would not be up. She would be, quote unquote, sleeping, and my father was on the road 5 days a week, literally gone from Monday to Friday. And of course, as you can imagine, this whole scene just kept deteriorating and deteriorating. So we're talking about neglect, yes. We're talking about abuse, yes. And we're also talking about childhood emotional neglect. So at 7 years old, I'm coming home from school and making my own meals, doing my own laundry, figuring things out, doing my homework by myself, getting myself up in the morning. And of course, on the weekends, we would pretend to be a family. It would be no surprise to hear that by the time I was 8 years old, my mother was experiencing severe gynecological problems, which would result in a 2.5-month hospitalization with 3 botched surgeries, the third one actually causing her to die on the operating table. And apparently this particular doctor had a very bad track record and couldn't afford to lose another patient. And so my mother was brought back and did not want to be on the earth plane anymore. She wanted to go home to her constellation of origin, which was the Pleiades, and she just wanted to be off the planet and out of pain. But she was brought back. She eventually physically recovered, and we resumed some semblance of family life after financial and emotional devastation. Of course, at this point, the alcoholism just exacerbates. And so all the way through my growing up years into junior high school, my mother's alcoholism became progressively worse. And we all learned to live with it. I looked at my father in retrospect. I don't know how the man remained married. I don't know how he retained his dignity, but somehow, to my parents' credit, they were able to put something together that looked like family life, but it was still grossly dysfunctional. So fast forward to, I'm now about 16 and a half years old, and I had a big outburst with my parents one night. I'll come back and talk about that in just a moment. By the time I was 18, my father had died of lung cancer, which was diagnosed really when it was too late. And of course, in amongst all of this, my mother's alcoholism had gotten worse and worse to the point that she could not take care of him, and I was taking care of him. I was the one driving him to the hospital for his radiation and chemo treatments. I was the one cooking for him, and my mother just had to escape in the best way that she could. And so I had actually, when he passed, just started music school, but my mother's condition was so bad that shortly after my father died, I drove her to the New Jersey State Mental Hospital and admitted her. I don't remember the drive. I remember coming home and that I was so exhausted by it all that I had broken out in hives. Ultimately, they would dry her out. She would return home and become, quote unquote, a dry alcoholic. Now, a few little side stories here. I remember when we had the memorial service for my father, one of our neighbors, who had finally become aware of the secret that the family kept, that my mother was a chronic alcoholic, bless her heart, said to me, Deidre, you have lost your father, but your mother has lost her husband, and that's more important. And Jayne, if I were to tell you anything about my life from the emotional and psychological aspect, that would be the nugget right there that would explain my entire life. In other words, everybody else's needs were more important than mine, which takes me back to telling the story when I was 16 and a half years old. So thank you for letting me deliver all of this information at the top of our conversation. So we were living in South Jersey at the time. It was a Sunday night, and I was just about halfway through my junior year in high school. And I was particularly exhausted that night and was in the kitchen just finishing up some things to get ready for school the next day. And my father came in the kitchen, and he started a sentence with Dedra, don't, and it was something about don't use too much hot water or don't whatever, I don't know. Not that we couldn't afford hot water, but it was something that he needed to vent. And of course, I had built up so much anger and rage toward both of my parents for the neglect and the abuse that I turned on him, and I just in that moment completely lost my respect and my self-control. And I remember looking at him over my left shoulder, and I'm going to use some unladylike words, so I'll caution our listeners about that. I said, Dad, shut up, you damn old bastard. And I thought, oh my word, I never would have even said damn or called anybody a name because I was raised to be so very polite. And he immediately retreated. And I remember abandoning my project in the kitchen and marching down the hall into the family room where both my parents were smoking their cigarettes, having their drinks, and watching television. And I got right between them and the television. And I became almost hysterical, shouting and screaming at them for a good 30 minutes. And I let 16 and a half years of neglect and abuse pour out and told them exactly how I felt about it. And they were so riveted and shocked by my behavior that they actually sat and listened. And when I was done delivering the venom, I marched upstairs to my bedroom, slammed the door so that I'm sure the entire house shook, sat down on the bed and began to sob and sob and sob. It was my father who came upstairs, gently knocked on my bedroom door, came in and sat on the bed with me, and he said, and I quote, Deidre, you're right. We have failed you. Now that's quite something for a tall, elegant German man to admit. And of course, at that point, I felt very much in power and still operating in the anger energy. And I remember folding my arms across my chest and saying, what would you like to do about it? And then I went on to say, if you wish to have a daughter, these are the things I have learned I am supposed to be able to expect from a parent. If you can do these things, you have a daughter. If not, no problem. I've not really had parents all of my life, so we can do whatever you want here. So the bottom line to this story is that for about 3 or 4 months, I was quote unquote in power, but it was very unbalanced and based on unhealthy situation, of course. But eventually my father and I, who I later figured out had great respect for me, would develop a relationship. The sad part is that within less than a year and a half, he would be gone from his physical body. But to this day, Jayne, I treasure the time that we did have when he picked up his trumpet again and we would go to orchestra rehearsals together. We would be on the road together. Sometimes he would take me out driving with him as he made his sales calls. And we developed a very respectful relationship that was in its own way at that point as healing as it could be. Ultimately, with my mother, it would take me years until literally the fall of 2016 to begin that healing journey. And I lived a life thinking I would go to my grave hating my mother and was happy to tell anybody I hated my mother. When she died in 1986, I was relieved. I mean, I was just absolutely relieved for her and for me because, as I said, she did not want to be here. So as I said, ultimately would take me until 2016 to heal with my mother. In 2009, I healed my relationship with my father, and with both parents, it was after they had left their physical bodies. And so I cherish these moments that we did have something that we could share together in the physical. I was able to, as a young woman, make peace with my mother's dis-ease, if we want to call it that, and all that she was dealing with. And of course, there are many other stories to talk about along the healing journey. Of course, my first book is about healing my relationship with my father. This next book coming out will be about the relationship with my mother and healing it, and then putting in format of understanding my parents. And again, as I finish this opening monologue, you can tell I've been in theater, right? Just to give an idea of the amount of neglect and abuse that I was living with. When I was 10 years old, I had, in the fall of that year, gotten what amounted to be walking pneumonia. And of course, being premature and dealing with a lot of respiratory difficulties, I would get pneumonia on a regular basis. And so my father, as I say, was on the road all the time, and my mother was drunk most of the time. And so apparently I'd gotten walking pneumonia in the fall of my 10th year. Of course, I was in 5th grade at the time. And by February of the following year, I remember being in the classroom in school one morning, and I remember thinking, gee, I smell something funny. I'm going to be very graphic here, so again, I caution our listeners. And I thought, I smell something funny. And I thought, it smells like vomit. This can't be right. And I had been exhausted for weeks and weeks and weeks, and sometimes didn't even know how I was going to get up and go to school, but I did. And I remember looking down at my hair, which was about shoulder length. And Jayne, there was vomit, dried vomit in my hair. And I was feeling sicker and sicker, and of course was sent to the nurse's office. And it was my father, who was actually happened to be working in town that day, who came to get me. And of course I was promptly taken to the doctor, and I had, at that time, double pneumonia, pleurisy, tonsillitis, and strep. And again, I had gone to school with dried vomit in my hair. Now, in today's world, my parents probably would have been in jail, but in those times, we didn't do that. So this was the degree of neglect and abuse. I was out of school for 6 weeks until I could recover. And actually, it was my father who tended to my caretaking at home. So that would be just the overview of how bad the neglect was and how bad the abuse was. And there was quite a bit of emotional abuse, right down to my mother telling me one day when she was quite drunk, and I was 12 years old, and I'm quoting, "Dedra, I'm damn sorry you were ever born." And I got it. I understood what was going on there, and I understood her pain. By the time I was a 12-year-old girl, I understood her pain. And of course, I lived in a lot of my own pain as well, and somehow thinking that everyone else's pain was somehow much more important than mine. So that's just the overview backstory of what I have lived with. Before we take this as oh, poor Dedra, again, from the spiritual aspect, I chose my parents very well, because as I have processed through my own healing journey, which has been profound and prolonged, these wounds have become and continue to become great gifts for me as far as wisdom goes, great gifts of growth, and I believe part of my education and foundation for my life mission. And so we can see why I am so much a proponent of healing. I'm aware very clearly of what happens when we don't heal our wounds, when we cannot take responsibility or we refuse to. And I'm very aware of the blessings and the exponential growth that happens when we do take responsibility, and the joy in healing our wounds. So that's my story, Jayne.
Wow. You know, I was thinking how traumatic it would be to come to this planet from a place of, love and connection. And then you do choose, like you say, that you chose well, so you would have this teaching to teach others. But just to go into that, a young infant, and to experience this disconnect and no love, and that manifests in the lungs as grief. So it's really interesting that you developed pneumonia. at such a young age. And
Oh, yes, the unexpressed emotions that had to come out. And of course, when I had the confrontation with my parents, which was verbally violent, when I was 16 and a half, it was very healing for me. And I realized in that moment that what we tend to do is we tend to bury these wounds, and then they come out as addiction or overwork or constant failure in life, for which we try to blame others. And until we actually confront the wound and the perpetrator, there is no healing. And this is where the actual forgiveness comes in. And so even though it was a very difficult 30 minutes where I was literally screaming at my parents, and again, keep in mind, I was raised to be extremely polite. It was my own healing as well as theirs. Can we imagine the guilt that my parents carried? They knew what they were doing. I mean, we all know who we are, right? So I just laid it all out on the table. Okay, here it is. Let's deal with it. Let's get it out in the open. Let's deal with it. And it was actually healing for all three of us. And then, of course, as I believe, acts like a pebble in the pond. So I'm a big proponent of confronting the wound, confronting the perpetrator, and then getting in there and doing the work, keeping in mind that the perpetrator themselves is damaged and is operating from a point of unhealedness and woundedness. So when do we get it right? When do we start to clear the decks? And so in my life, it was at 16 and a half years old, and I don't regret it. In fact, I celebrate the young woman who had the courage to stand up to her parents and say, "You have done wrong by me, and this is what's gone wrong, and either we correct it and we can heal, or if you can't correct it, I'm fine because I've figured out how to do life on my own." And I have great praise for my 16 and a half year old girl, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Right? Well, yeah, and that can be the first step. It's just standing up in your power and looking at it straight in the face, rather than, like, so often we feel disempowered through guilt and shame, and we keep it, we don't stand up in our own power. So that was the first step for you. And then seeing,
Yes.
and now you can see that your mother was, had her own wounds, and brings compassion. But wow, at 16, that was incredible. So yeah, just tell us what happened next and more of your beautiful story.
Well, you just said something that I'd like to pick up on, Jayne. You said that I became aware my mother had her own wounds. And of course, I knew this by the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old. I didn't know what to do to help her. I don't know that any 10 or 12-year-old girl does, or even boy. But as I healed in 2016, and that's another story altogether, and I became aware of more details of her past, my heart of compassion opened. And of course, I began to understand her. And quite frankly, I don't know how the woman got out of bed every morning. I don't know how she did life. I don't know how she managed to stay on the planet. I don't know how she managed to show up sober any place and put beautiful clothing on and be the beautiful woman she was, the articulate, conversational, very intelligent, charming woman that she was. I don't know how she did any of those things. I don't know how she got herself sober enough to cook a meal when she was able. I don't know how the woman ever did life. And so as I began to understand and have more compassion, I've lost track of the times since 2016 that I have sat down and wept, sobbed from my gut for her pain, for the attacks against her dignity, her person, that were instigated and propagated against her. So that is key, is understanding. And when we are able to be transparent enough, and I'm talking to myself at the same time as I'm talking to you and our listeners, to really take a look inside ourselves and see what is running our gears, and look at the wounds that are causing us to behave the way we are or experience life the way we are. Life isn't going to work for us. We'll keep repeating failure and frustration. And we'll try all sorts of things, all sorts of behavior modification techniques, behavior modification techniques. I will learn to speak English at some point. That's my joke for the day. Um, and we try therapists, we try everything. We try everything we know, and we get really close to the wound. And sometimes we think we've resolved it. But if that wound is active and still driving our subconscious mechanism, it's going to be there and show up and show up and show up until we actually have the courage to address it. And we address it when we are ready and not until. And this, of course, is where all of us live. But again, to come back to what you triggered me about, until I was able to understand my mother, I was not able to do anything except be in a state of fury, anger, and rage. And it was her healing as well as mine. And that's where I live, healing for all.
Yeah. And you brought up something again for me to think about, and something I've learned from my own studies is that our unconscious brain is 95% of our brain, and it's programmed completely from the time we're 0 to 7. So, all of these things are part of our being, but we're so unaware of how we get triggered and just how much that part of us remembers every little detail, so. Yeah,
Right, every little detail. I still have blank spots in my memory. There's still things that I weeks, days, years that I cannot remember, that I've blocked out. So you see, for me, it's an ongoing healing process. And I pray, I ask my soul, I ask God, I ask the universe, whatever we want to call that, to have these memories excavated and revealed to me as I am ready to work with them. And sometimes I even play with them. So it's not all gloom and doom. It can actually be very invigorating to do that. And you're very right, Jayne, that 95% of our brain functions at the subconscious level. And so we talked about forgiveness. What happens beyond forgiveness? And if you'll permit me to talk about the word forgiveness for a bit here, I'm an absolute believer in forgiveness. It has to happen. I think we also operate beyond forgiveness. Here's the danger with the concept of forgiveness. It can be misused when we're not really ready to do our work, and we can go to somebody and ask forgiveness, and really all we want at that point is a reprieve or a pat on the head that says, it's okay what you did to me. I don't mind. It's okay. I forgive you. Or we can even do that with another. I forgive you, because we ourselves don't want to actually face the depth of the wound. So we have to be very careful with forgiveness, because it can be misused and actually make the perpetrator not guilty, when in fact they've done nothing to confront their own woundedness and acknowledge the damage they've done to another and be willing to make restitution. In other words, make a genuine apology and engage in corrective behavior for themselves and for others. And again, I say that, engage in corrective behavior, making restitution. So we have to be very careful that we don't move to forgiveness too soon. And I have actually in my own life deliberately withheld forgiveness with a person and told them, I am withholding forgiveness from you because I am choosing to hold your feet to the fire until you are able to acknowledge the damage you have done by your own sin or wound against me. The damage you've done to me, until you're able to see what your actions have created in me, I am withholding forgiveness. Because if I forgive too quickly, then you don't get to see what you've done. Therefore, you don't get the chance to look at your own unwounded or your own unhealed wounds. So it's a very delicate and tricky process, and I think we need to have great intuition about when to apply forgiveness, when to let it sit on the back burner and employ other tools. I think then that the next step is what we all now are coming to understand as you in the medical field: neuroplasticity, retraining, re-educating the brain, and I believe ultimately removing the energy that has been operating the brain that has been based on wounds. In other words, literally retraining the brain and the mind to work at a different level. And at that point, I speak spiritually, coming into the sovereignty of the soul, healing the soul trauma, and making the wound as if it never happened, so that we now can operate from a sovereign, healed, and whole condition, which I believe is so necessary on planet Earth at this time in history.
Yeah, wow. And healing, like when you talk about neuroplasticity, what I've learned is that we do develop circuits that can get triggered and they can become quite ingrained. And there's some that allow for our survival. And that's why we, have this barrier between the conscious and the unconscious, because a lot of what's there doesn't want to just pop out all the time. But some of these circuits that have been trained and can get triggered so easily have to be broken in order to become sovereign again, like you say.
Yes, and that's our right, is to be sovereign beings and not be controlled by things. And again, I spoke about we're living in such a perilous time in the planet's history, and yet in a way it's not perilous. It just simply needs to happen, and there's great blessing happening. There's great goodness going on. What I have become aware of is, in my own life, is that the unhealed part of me is where the evil can take hold. So those vestiges of anger, of rage, of feeling as a victim, all of those what we would call negative emotions, is where the evil sneaks in, and where then I will turn around and try to damage somebody else, or somebody else will try to damage me, or whatever. And if we apply that in our neighborhoods, our cities, our countries, globally, we have exactly where we are right now. A lot of evil systems in the background attempting to run the world, attempting to derail us, attempting to believe or help us or cause us to believe really that we're not sovereign, attempting to force us into these systems that are broken. Our medical system is struggling. Our financial system is clearly broken. Our churches try their best to help us, and they're struggling. I mean, all of our systems on the planet, as we can see, are in a state of collapse because they don't work, because they're based on the fact that we need someone else to tell us what to do, because we don't know. And we don't know because we're so wounded and so full of sin and anger and so full of evil that we need somebody else to rescue us, and somebody else to tell us what to do and how to live. And of course, that's the ultimate lie, because each of us as a sovereign soul does know how to live. And so this idea of taking personal responsibility, not as, oh, no, I have to do that for myself and I'm too wounded, I'm too tired. Well, yes, we are too wounded and too tired to have yet another burden put on us. But if we can see the healing process, the eradication of the wound and the evil as a state of privilege and joy and delight, then we are more inclined to operate in hopeful energy, that we do indeed have the strength to stop our lives, pause, and look at what is causing us difficulty in our lives. It is then and only then that we're able to attract the right support and the right help that we need. And oftentimes it is beyond the current old systems that we currently have in place that we find are crumbling. I hope I explained all that well enough so that it actually is followable. That's a new word, Jayne.
Yeah. Well, you have so much to share. But what I really like is, the system that's in place right now in order to control. Can you just expand on that more? Because that's like key. It's key within us. It's key to our own empowerment and freedom or sovereignty, but also as a planet, as humanity.
Right. I hear the smile in your voice, and of course we can hear the smile in mine. In my generation, we grew up with the threat of nuclear war, and I grew up in a school system that we all sat in our neat little rows of chairs, and there were rules and regulations, which I'm all about as a Virgo and a conductor and all those things. I'm all about respect for authority. But when we look at what's driving the authority is where the truth really reveals itself. And so you're very right. From the time we're infants to up about 7 years old, we are formed at that point. And so if we just think about our school experience, we were all basically lined up and told this is how it is, and at that point we tended to lose our individuality because we all had to do the same thing at the same time. And then we talk about the medical system, and you are yourself a naturopath, a homeopath, which I have great praise for. And if we just talk about the medical system, and I worked in a hospital for 3 years, and I saw at that time that we were living in that environment where the doctors were gods and they told us what to do. And they somehow knew so much better than we did. And of course, me being me, I railed against that even then, because I thought, wait, I'm the one who knows my body. So if I just talk about the medical system for a moment, with great respect for my allopathic doctor friends and for my nurse friends and the people who mean to do so much good, the system then was geared toward the doctor is God and the patient knows nothing. And we had it completely backwards. And as I went through my own healing process, I realized that when I was with a physician, I was the employer. In other words, I was hiring a healthcare helper to help me take care of my body in ways that I might not be able to figure out myself. And so that changed the dynamic quite a bit. Now, as I grew into that and began to interact with mostly allopathic physicians, not all of them understood that, and so some of them had to be summarily fired. And I say that with the deepest amount of respect, because if I was going to be their employer and expected them to function as an employee and they did not understand that, it was not going to serve them either. So I've long been a believer that if I hire the right healthcare helper, the relationship is completely different than doctor-patient. It's two human beings meeting on equal footing to serve each other and to explore new techniques of healing and do it with such honor and respect that both parties benefit. And there were many times that I've shown up at a doctor's office and realized that that staff or that doctor needed me to be there with my bright light or my love or my shining soul as much as I needed whatever that person had to offer. And I find that many of my healthcare friends are exhausted, totally drained, because we've been educated that, again, as patients, we just cast ourselves on the doctor or the nurse and just turn our sovereignty over to them, where they're somehow totally responsible for us, which is, as I say, completely backwards. What I'm delighted about is, especially in the last 20 years, I see naturopathy, homeopathy coming into the fore once again, taking its proper place. And I see this idea of holistic medicine and the employer of the healthcare helper standing up and taking joyous responsibility for their own well-being and letting it be a journey of, many times, the quote-unquote patient telling the quote-unquote doctor, this is what I need and this is what I would like you to do. And that just sets me in such joy. And of course, here again, I offer my praise to what you and Shelley are doing and creating. And it's not about power one over the other. It's about personal in and empowerment. And this is where the sovereignty and the growth happens. And of course, this extends beyond the medical world into the financial system, that we are sovereign souls. We have great wealth, each of us as individuals. We know that our political system is so corrupt worldwide, and bless their hearts. There are many people in the political arena who really want to see the new earth come forward, want to see this glorious utopia that we all remember from many past lives, from in the spirit of our soul. And many people in government who really mean well, many people in law enforcement, but we're dealing with systems that have become corrupt by their very nature. And it's just simply time to let them break down and let the phoenix arise from the ashes. And this is part of where I am living my life to create something so brand new that is actually ancient, by the way, that our souls all remember, and to go through this process. And why, again, Jayne, I have such excitement for what you and Shelley are doing, both as professionals in your field, and why I'm so excited, and it's such an honor for me to be on this podcast and begin creating this new thing that I think so many of us on the planet know is correct and long for deep in our souls.
Yeah, just remembering how powerful we are, And just to add to that conversation, I've always contemplated is in the medical field, if someone comes to me, they're almost afraid to tell me they've gone to see someone else, because often there's this arrogance, that one person has all the information and you can't sway from that, or you'll be fired as a patient,
Right.
And I believe that is backwards too, that somebody needs to go to whoever they need to go to, and it could be 10 people, and there should be collaboration, and they can get all that information in many different ways and then make their own choice. So that is, something else we really need to revamp.
Right. Right. Well, we talk about ego, and I believe that the word ego actually means I go. So it's an action energy. And I believe we cannot separate it from ourselves, or we lose the action part of ourselves any more than we can remove our mind. And these aspects of ourselves need to be under the sovereign guidance of our soul. So when we talk about the arrogance and ego of anybody in any profession, we're really talking about something that's fear-based. And you just said that, Jayne, that there can be a fear on the part of any healthcare helper, because again, if the patient is, I use that word in quotes, is not taking responsibility for themselves, then that poor doctor feels an enormous weight of responsibility that is really not his or hers. And I really, really admire what you said, because the ultimate goal is for all of us to heal and work together. And I mean, myself, as a professional in the entertainment industry, I'm not the only conductor on the planet. I'm not the only singer, the only composer. And there are other people from whom I learn on a regular basis, even at this point in my career. There's always something new to be learned. There's always some new collaboration, always some synergy of energies that we get together, and I can add this to that. I can add that. It's contributionism. It's bringing my gifts to the banquet table and saying, let's create a delicious and very large banquet for all of us to benefit from. And that's where we go beyond the frightened ego and we go into inspired action. And I got that phrase, by the way, from that inspired action from Marco Misinato. I have such praise and such blessing for him. And I know he's been a recent guest on your show. And he talks about inspired action. And here's a man for whom English is second, I believe, is second language. And I lived with that in my head so many times. And just on a Skype call a couple years ago, Marco talked about inspired action just in part of his sentence, and those words stuck with me. It was just a conversation about what he was doing with his music, and this was a great gift that he gave me just naturally, showing up as himself, and it inspires me and guides me on a minute-to-minute basis. Sometimes here I am all these years later in California, and I'll hear his beautiful voice with that wonderful Italian inflection in his English saying inspired action. So Marco, my hat is off to you for saying that. Thank you so much for speaking that. This is where we all work together, Jayne, where we all serve each other. And you can hear that I'm sitting up a little straighter in my chair here in California, and I'm a little more excited. I'm just a little more energetic, and you can have the smile on my face. This is where I get excited, because we all work together to serve each other from the point of our highest ability and our deepest woundedness. This is the magic that we can create on this planet now.
Yeah, and we can't do it unless we own it and truly be who we are.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I have a question for you, Jayne, if I may turn this around. I am eager to know what, if I may ask this, what inspired you to create this wonderful podcast?
Mostly what we were just talking about. So my
Right.
smile was huge because I could see that there was action on the planet to take away our sovereign right to make our own choice for our own body and our own well-being. And I just wanted people to listen to themselves and realize how powerful they are. And so that's
Wow.
what I just want to share with so many people that bring forward that message in many different ways. And yeah, and that we can look and search and get the information from many, many sources and from within ourselves, and then make our own choices.
Right, right. It's beautiful, Jayne. It's just, well, the bottom line is that we all know. We know who we are. Our soul is sovereign. We know. We just simply know. And of course, we talk about education, which I think I had shared with you in another conversation. I have long been a believer that for the student entering first grade, the education about the human body needs to begin then, and of course grow exponentially throughout their 12 years of schooling. So by the time the average individual graduates high school, they know as much about their body and its workings as any healthcare helper they would hire. And this goes along with understanding our world too, understanding how does nature really work? How do our bodies really work? This is being sorely neglected in our education system, so that when, as an adult, you begin to hire healthcare helpers, you know as much as or at least half as much or as much as possible as the person you're hiring to help you. And it's like, if you own a car and you don't know, where the engine is, then you take it to the mechanic and you can easily be bamboozled. So it's really about this empowerment through education as well. And I believe if this actually happens as part of our education system, that it changes the game quite a bit. So I think you're contributing to that, Jayne, in your own way. And we adults now are having to go back and backtrack and say, oh, I didn't learn that. Oh, that's where my pancreas really is. Oh, that's what my liver really does. That's how my heart really functions. That's how my eyes really work. That's how grief and anger really affect my body. This is what my energetic body does, what my emotional body does. Oh, I have a headache. Oh, that must be caused by an emotional strain or whatever. We begin to really look at the whole person and how the traumas have affected us and how they really work. And we begin to then grow and understand. And as I said before, this is I think it's our frontier, and we're all of us in our own way traversing it. And again, this is where I get so excited for all of us.
Me too. And to teach that our mental, emotional affects our body, and just how profoundly, if we were aware of that from a young age, a lot of illness could be curbed by dealing with it.
How much of it could be completely avoided if we can clear the emotional body. Now, of course, what I'm doing at this point in my life is I'm going back through every arena and every area of my life and asking to be shown where original wounds happened, even in the womb or in previous lives. So I can understand, if my hip is feeling particularly tender on a specific day, or my stomach hurts, or my shoulder hurts. What's really going on? What is my body really trying to tell me? What is that information? And to sit with that and ask my body to talk to me. And there are many times when I'll be sitting with my hip and massaging my left piriformis muscle or my left quadratus laborum. And you can tell I've been through physical therapy, right? And go ahead and laugh, Jayne. It's okay. I know the names of muscles, and I have other names for them sometimes besides the proper ones. But that's the dancer in me. But I'll listen to my body. I'm learning to listen, and I'm learning also to let buried memories trigger and come before me and say, that's the root of that. And then begin my own Reiki on myself, or my own prayer process, or sing to myself using music to heal myself, whatever, crystals, whatever it is I need to use, and get that part of my body to respond to it. And of course, I am my own laboratory right now, and I laugh at myself because I'm the physician of my own soul and my own body. And so every so often I'll say to myself, Dedra, listen to yourself. Physician, heal thyself, Dedra. Physician, heal thyself, Dedra. And so I'm growing. And as I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, I believe I'm developing some front of the line, frontiering, pioneering healing protocol that I'll have more to say about as I develop it more. And I'm testing it with myself to see if it actually does work as well as I think. And so far, I'm very excited. And again, this is part of the sovereign soul and us discovering how to really live those full, complete, and wonderful lives that we are absolutely correct in living.
Yes, and I love what you said. Oh, so, and you know, there's so many ways to get to it. And you even brought up some laughter about, you know, heal yourself, Deidre. And the first, I
Yeah,
remember, I remember Louise Hay was one of my, you know, one of the first books I read. And she has this book where that attaches the emotion to the physical and where you'll feel it in your body.
right.
And I remember dancing and we were about to compete, like, you know, a few minutes later, and my left knee gave out. And
Ooh,
but I knew that from reading her book that the knees are connected to ego and that I was afraid of being judged.
right.
Right. And so as soon as I recognized what was going on, my knees strengthened and I was fine. So sometimes it's that easy, just
Right.
recognizing it. Sometimes.
It's that easy. And I'm so glad you share this, Jayne. And I know we're coming, the podcast host and me is looking at the time going, oh, gee, I know we're coming to the end of our time, but this is so important because you were able to recognize it and work with it immediately. And it didn't have to be years of therapy, draining your checkbook or your bank account, or you sobbing on the floor week after week after week, or losing your job. It was something that was easy, snap, snap, and it was done. And I think this is one of the reasons so many of us, including myself, delay and put off the healing process because we expect it to be painful and difficult and arduous and all sorts of other ugly words. Sometimes it's as simple as your wonderful story of, oh, the knee is about fear. It's about fear of being judged, which means, of course, we're in self-judgment. You know, we think that we're not good enough, and they're gears grinding way back from our childhood when somebody invalidated us and told us we weren't good enough or couldn't do something well. And so that now is just simply up for healing. And all you did was not all, but look at the efficiency with how you handle that. Oh, that's what this is. You went right to work on it, snap, step, and then I assume you went on and had a beautiful time dancing and a joyous reunion with your full sovereign self. Am I right?
Yes, it was wonderful. And part of it was thinking about it, was being able to laugh at myself, you know, not taking it too seriously and knowing
Right.
it's just a human trait and we all have it. So let it go, you know.
Right, right. And I just said something that I just spoke brilliant words, and every so often I'll find brilliant words that even I'm impressed with, and so picture me just just sitting up straight and kind of pushing my hair off my shoulder and having a moment of 2.5 seconds of human ego. But now that I've laughed at myself, let's come back and say these words again: joyous reunion with myself. Joyous reunion with myself. And I have a feeling that this is answered prayer for me. I said as we were just getting on Zoom this morning that I knew our words would be perfect. I think these are words I need to speak for myself, and I am willing to bet my last dime, my last US American dime, that there are people who need to hear this phrase, joyous reunion with myself. And that's the invitation that I offer to myself and to everyone who comes in my field. I put on your wonderful form, tenacious ability. I think I put tenacious ability or decision to love. And
Yeah.
so if someone comes in my field, I want to tell them they're loved because I grew up without love. So of course I'm trying to heal myself. And of course, I'm working on the joyous reunion with myself. We teach what we so desperately want to learn. And I say that with reverence and respect for the process, not criticism or invalidation. And this is where we all can serve each other and form these wonderful healing communities. We acknowledge we live on the third rock from the sun. We've been traumatized. Great. How can that trauma help us and serve us and cause us to grow and move us into joyous reunion with myself? And that causes laughter to just erupt from my gut and say, oh, how beautiful is that joyous reunion with myself? That's the invitation.
Yeah, because when you can see it and it tries to remain hidden, but when you see it with joy, it does, it is a reunion.
Yes. Yes. Oh my, I needed to laugh today, Jayne. Thank you for letting me hear the smile in your voice and
Oh,
laughing along with me. How delightful.
Deidre, and you had an amazing forgiveness with your mother after she passed. So just as we end, share that, because that is one, it's like, it's incredible because it's a story of how things don't end.
Right. Well, my mother died in a house fire in 1986, and fire is very, very, very cleansing. And that was a trauma in itself. And as I say, I was relieved. Fast forward now to the year of 2016, and I had had a very difficult professional year. I'd lost a couple major deals that could have changed my life substantially, and nothing was working. Personal relationships weren't working, my living situation wasn't working, and my professional career was really in a very, very, very down place. And I had a dear friend named Jayne, spelled Jane, and she became a surrogate mother for me. And one came over to the house, and she'd been coaching with me for a while, really wanting me to heal. And nothing she could say would help. And because I was still carrying such rage about my mother. And she said, Deidre, I would never hurt you for anything, but I need to speak words to you. And I had hoped that you would come to this conclusion yourself. And I said, Jayne, please, because I'm desperate. I'm my back is to the wall and I can't see the forest for the trees. Please speak. And I knew that she would treat me with care and not be abrupt or hurtful as so many well-meaning people do when they come to you and say, well, you have this problem and you have that problem and there's this wrong with you and that wrong with you and go fix yourself. And that, of course, is a very, very, very bad way to handle people. But she very gently spoke and she said, I see that you have three major roadblocks: your mother, men, and money. And I said, bingo. And I don't know what to do about it. And I began to sob. And she said, let me walk this with you. And so she offered for me to come and stay at her guest house for about a week. And she said, just come and be. Everything will be done for you. You won't have to cook a meal. Just come and be. And so I did. And in my preparation the night before I got ready to stay at her guest house, I sat down in what I call my reading or my prayer chair, and I tell the story as sincerely as I can. I heard my mother's voice as clearly as I'm hearing mine speak. My mother was a no-nonsense woman, and I have great respect for her. She said, Deidre, get up out of the chair, go in the bathroom, look at yourself in the mirror, and forgive yourself for hating me. I gave you no choice. Now, it's rare that I can say that without sobbing. So I was obedient. I got up, went to the bathroom, looked at my face, and I saw such pain on this beautiful face that I've been given. And I began to sob. And I had to release the guilt and shame for the rage and anger I felt for my mother and the hate. But she confessed, I gave you no choice but to hate me. So I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And then I went the next morning to stay at Jayne's guest house. This was in Florida. And as I communed with her in the spirit realms or the quantum energetic field, the heavenly realms, whatever we wish to call it, the information about her life that she had so carefully kept hidden began to emerge. And I was actually, and I'm going to sound a little woo-woo here, I was actually shown the scene of her rape when she was 19 years old, shown it as vividly as I'm looking at the desk in front of me or my hands in front of my face. And it was stunning. And at that point, my heart of compassion opened for her and I began to sob for her, not for me, but for her. And that was the key, the moment that released everything that had been built up in hers and my distorted, misunderstood relationship. And little by little from there, I was able to unravel the things that were said and done and understand them. And even as recently as this past March, I was with our friend Wenda Blake, And a memory from when I was 3 months old came forward, and it just took my breath away. And that's a conversation for another time. And I was able to go back and reframe that, re-understand it, and begin to unwind the damage that was stored, and then created all of these other stories and tangled webs of misinformation and misunderstanding. So that was the start of it for me in the fall of 2016. And from there, I was able to open up what I call conversations with my mother in the other realms, and literally hear her voice, see her face, and fall in love with my mother, and begin to understand her from the eagle's eye perspective or the spiritual perspective, and really become appreciative of who she was, and release my own pain. And that, as I say, is the subject of my next book with both of my parents, and much conversation for the future. And the bottom line is, Jayne, I am so grateful to a woman named Jayne who stood with me, had the courage to come forward, loved me, treated me with dignity and respect, held me so closely in her arms, and provided the space for me to do my sovereign healing without judgment and with only praise for my efforts. So I'm grateful.
Right? And grateful for the experience you had. You can see now that it led to you understanding all of this and being able to share it.
Right. What a privilege. What a total privilege.
Yeah. If we could only see the bigger picture when we're in pain.
I think we're getting to that point now where we are, Jayne, and of course the value of what you and I are sharing today. I so bless this conversation, and I pray that it goes far and wide, literally around the world, to precisely the people it needs to go to at precisely the right time for them.
Exactly. I pray.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your sharing.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
And to everyone else out there, don't give your power away to anyone else. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Jayne, and blessings.
Blessings.